There is a particular kind of story that never truly dies, one that lodges itself in the human imagination so completely that 2,000 years of scrutiny, skepticism, and outright debunking cannot dislodge it. The story of Atlantis is exactly that kind of story. Picture it for a moment, an island empire of almost incomprehensible grandeur. Its harbour walls gleaming with orichalcum that caught the Mediterranean sun like living fire. Its docks crowded with 1,000 warships. Its people so assured of their own permanence that the idea of collapse must have felt like a joke told in a foreign language. And then, in the span of a single catastrophic day and night, all of it gone swallowed by the ocean, leaving behind nothing but churned mud, a silent sea, and a question that has refused to stop echoing across the centuries. Did such a place truly exist, or was it conjured whole from the mind of one extraordinarily gifted philosopher, deployed as a warning that his own civilization was too proud and too blind to hear? That question is the engine of everything that follows, because the story of Atlantis is not simply a tale about a sunken island. It is a mirror one held up to every civilization that has ever made the fatal mistake of believing itself immune to the forces that have destroyed every great power before it. The story begins not in ocean depths or buried archive, but in the marble-columned calm of ancient Athens. Around 360 years before the Christian era, a philosopher named Plato, already in the final decades of a life spent interrogating the nature of justice, beauty, and the ideal state, sat down to write 2 dialogues that would ignite centuries of argument. These works, the Timaeus and the incomplete Critias, remain, to this day, the sole ancient source for everything the world believes it knows about Atlantis. That fact alone should give us pause. An entire civilization, an empire said to have been larger than Libya and Asia combined, survives in the historical record through exactly one author and exactly 2 texts. Plato constructed his account through a carefully layered chain of authority designed to lend the story the weight of genuine antiquity. The narrator is a character named Critias, based loosely on Plato's own great-grandfather, who claims to have received the tale through generations of oral transmission stretching back to Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver and one of the 7 sages of the ancient world. According to this framework, Solon had travelled to Egypt around 590 years before Plato's time, arriving at the sacred city of Sais on the Nile Delta, where priests of extraordinary learning presided over temple archives they claimed stretched back into the deepest corridors of time. These priests, Solon was told, possessed records of civilizations so ancient that the Greeks themselves were mere children by comparison, a people who had forgotten their own oldest stories because of the catastrophes and floods that periodically reset human memory. And in those records, the priest said, was preserved the account of a mighty island nation that had once threatened to conquer the entire known world, before the gods themselves intervened and erased it from the face of the earth. What Plato does with this framing is sophisticated to a degree that is easy to underestimate. By rooting the story through Solon, a historical figure of unimpeachable credibility, a man synonymous with wisdom and honest governance, and anchoring it in Egyptian temple records rather than Greek oral tradition, he grants Atlantis a pedigree that feels genuinely ancient rather than freshly invented. Egypt, in the Greek imagination, was the repository of all genuine knowledge, the civilization against whose depth and antiquity even Athens appeared youthful. To say that Egyptian priests had preserved this account for 9,000 years before Plato's own time was to place it so far beyond the reach of verification or challenge that it occupied a kind of sacred historical space real enough to take seriously, remote enough to be impossible to disprove. That 9,000-year gap is one of the most consequential numbers in Western intellectual history, because it does 2 things simultaneously. It lends the story an air of mythological authority, and it positions the events at a geological horizon that later generations would find strangely plausible, the immediate aftermath of the last great ice age, when sea levels were genuinely rising, coastlines genuinely vanishing, and the world was undergoing transformations so dramatic that later peoples might reasonably have preserved the memory of them as catastrophe. Plato, whether he was crafting pure allegory or drawing on something older and stranger, chose his chronology with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was building. The Timaeus introduces Atlantis briefly. Almost as a prologue, the ancient city of Athens once stood as the perfect embodiment of the ideal state, successfully defending the Mediterranean world against the aggressive expansion of a maritime empire to the west. This preliminary sketch establishes the moral architecture of the entire narrative, a contest between virtue and corruption, between restraint and imperial appetite. The Critias then delivers the full description, the concentric rings of land and water, the glistening capital, the 10 kings, the sacred laws, the slow moral unravelling of a people who had begun as the children of a god and gradually became something far more dangerous, a civilization convinced that power was the same thing as wisdom. Plato never finished the Critias. It breaks off mid-sentence. At precisely the moment when the gods of Olympus gather to pass judgment on Atlantis, whether this incompleteness was deliberate, a final rhetorical gesture, leaving the punishment to the reader's imagination, or simply the accident of mortality and unfinished manuscripts, we cannot say. What we can say is that the abrupt silence at the story's climax has haunted readers for more than 2 millennia, and that the question Plato left hanging in the air has never stopped demanding an answer. Plato was many things philosopher, mathematician, political theorist, student of Socrates, but the description of Atlantis in the Critias reveals something else entirely, a world builder of startling precision and imaginative force. What he constructed on the page was not a vague mythological paradise, but a civilization rendered in specific measurements, named materials, enumerated populations, and mapped infrastructure. The level of detail is almost architectural in its confidence, and that confidence is part of what has made Atlantis so persistently difficult to dismiss. Vague legends fade. Legends with dimensions, engineering specifications, and named metals have a way of lodging in the mind like blueprints for something that ought to exist. The island itself, as Plato describes it, was positioned in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow passage where the familiar Mediterranean world gave way to the open, mostly uncharted ocean that Greeks and Romans regarded with a mixture of fascination and dread. The island's scale was staggering, larger than Libya and Asia combined, a claim that, taken literally, would make Atlantis not an island at all but a continent. Some later scholars have argued that Plato was speaking loosely, using Libya and Asia as they were understood in his era, rather than as we define them today. But even by those reduced measurements, the implied territory was vast enough to have supported a civilization of genuinely imperial ambitions. Beyond the main island, Plato tells us, Atlantis controlled a chain of smaller islands extending further into the Atlantic, and from there held sway over portions of the continental landmasses on either side territories in what we would recognize as Europe and North Africa, all organized under Atlantean dominion. The capital city at the island's heart was the jewel of this empire, and Plato's description of it reads like something designed by an engineer who also happened to be a poet. At the very center stood the original hill where the god Poseidon had settled his mortal lover Cleito, and around this hill Poseidon himself had carved alternating rings of sea and land, 2 rings of land and 3 of water, each concentric band serving both defensive and practical purposes. The innermost island, roughly 5 miles in diameter, held the royal palace and the great temple complex. Moving outward, each ring of water was wide enough to accommodate ships, and tunnels had been excavated through the land rings to allow vessels to pass from one harbour level to the next, so that the entire capital functioned as a kind of tiered maritime fortress accessible only by sea. The outermost ring of water was the largest, stretching nearly half a mile across and serving as the city's main harbour, a space Plato says was perpetually crowded with merchant ships and triremes from every corner of the Atlantean world. The noise and commerce of an empire concentrated into a single dazzling waterfront. Standing at the edge of that outer harbour and looking inward, a visitor would have seen the city rising in concentric brilliance. Each ring wall gleaming with a different metal, the outermost covered in bronze, the middle wall coated in tin, and the innermost wall sheathed entirely in orichalcum, a material Plato describes as second in value only to gold. Reddish in colour, mined from the earth in many parts of the island, and completely unknown to the later world. Scholars have debated orichalcum's identity for centuries. Some believe it was a natural alloy of copper and zinc, a form of brass that ancient metallurgists could produce, but that later civilizations lost the formula for. Others have suggested it was entirely fictional, a literary device deployed to signal the civilization's extraordinary wealth through the simple mechanism of inventing a precious metal that no one could go looking for. At the absolute centre of the city, on that original sacred hill, stood the temple of Poseidon, and here Plato's description reaches heights of almost hallucinatory grandeur. The temple measured 600 feet in length and 300 feet in width, proportions that dwarf even the Parthenon. Athens' greatest architectural achievement, and a building Plato's original audience would have known intimately. The exterior was silver, its pinnacles gold. Inside, the ceiling was a canopy of carved ivory, set with gold and silver and orichalcum. The floor, the walls, the columns all gleamed with metal inlay, and, dominating the interior, reaching nearly to the ceiling, stood a colossal statue of Poseidon himself, the god standing upright in a golden chariot, driving 6 winged horses of supernatural size, surrounded by a retinue of 100 Nereids riding dolphins. Around the temple's exterior stood golden statues of all 10 of the original Atlantean kings and their queens, frozen in precious metal as permanent monuments to the dynasty that Poseidon himself had founded. The effect Plato describes a building that blazed with reflected sunlight across the harbour. Visible from the sea long before a ship reached the city's outer walls, is less architecture than theatrical statement, a civilization announcing itself to the world in the language of overwhelming material power. It is worth pausing here to consider what Plato's audience would have made of all this. These were people who had built the Parthenon, who had traded with Egypt and Persia, who understood monumental architecture at a sophisticated level. When Plato offered them a temple that made the Parthenon look modest, a harbour that dwarfed Piraeus, walls sheathed in metals that didn't exist, he was not describing the familiar ancient world scaled up, he was gesturing towards something categorically beyond it. Whether that gesture was an invitation to wonder, or a warning about excess dressed in the language of wonder, is the question that gives the entire description its strange, unresolved tension. Beyond the capital itself, the island's interior was a study in engineered abundance. A vast rectangular plain stretched out from the city, enclosed by mountains to the north and opening to the sea to the south. Crisscrossed by an elaborate canal system, the main channel 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and over 1,000 miles long, connecting the central city to the coastline and allowing goods and troops to flow across the entire territory with military efficiency. Smaller lateral canals created a grid across the plain, feeding both irrigation and transportation, and the whole system supported agricultural yields so consistent and so generous that the plain produced 2 harvests every single year. This was not a civilization scraping sustenance from reluctant soil. This was an empire with a fully rationalized landscape, a food production system designed from the ground up to support a population of millions and a military of incomprehensible scale, and the infrastructure to move both anywhere they needed to go. Every great empire in history has required 2 things to sustain itself: a system of governance capable of managing vast territories and diverse populations, and a military capable of defending and expanding those territories against rivals who want what the empire has built. Atlantis, as Plato constructs it, possessed both and the specific details he provides about each are among the most remarkable passages in the entire account. Combining the grandiosity of myth with the procedural specificity of a military census or a constitutional document, the governmental structure Plato describes is unlike anything that existed in the Greek world of his time, though it shares DNA with several political systems he analysed and criticised in his other works. 10 kings ruled simultaneously over Atlantis, and its external territories not rivals or competitors, but co-rulers bound by shared lineage, shared laws, and a system of collective governance that required them to subordinate personal ambition to the common interest of the dynasty. Each of these 10 kings was a direct descendant of Atlas, the firstborn son of Poseidon and the mortal woman Plato, making the entire ruling class simultaneously a royal family and a religious institution. Their authority derived not from conquest or election, but from divine blood. Atlas himself gave his name to both the island and the surrounding ocean, a detail that links the Atlantis narrative to Greek cosmological tradition in ways that either suggest genuine mythological depth or reveal Plato constructing a story, with carefully embedded cultural resonances designed to make it feel older and more authentic than it was. The 10 kings gathered every 5th year and every 6th year in alternation, a rhythm that itself encoded a kind of cosmic balance. The cycles of governance calibrated to something beyond mere political convenience, meeting in the temple of Poseidon to deliberate on matters affecting the entire empire, to judge violations of their sacred laws, and to renew their collective commitment to the principles that supposedly made Atlantean governance just rather than merely powerful. Before each assembly, they participated in a ritual that has captured imaginations ever since. Plato described it a bull hunt conducted without iron weapons, using only wooden clubs and nooses, in which the kings pursued sacred bulls that roamed freely within the temple precinct. The captured bull was then sacrificed at the great pillar of orichalcum on which the laws of Atlantis were inscribed. Its blood poured over the inscription as both offering and oath. The kings then bathed, dressed in magnificent blue robes, and sat in judgment by the fire's dying light, rendering decisions that would hold until the next assembly. There is something genuinely haunting about this image. Rulers of the greatest civilization in the world, kneeling in firelight before a column of impossible metal, binding themselves to principles carved in a language older than their own empire. It reads less like history and more like a memory of what governance could be, at its most earnest and its most serious, before the slow rot of ambition set in. And then there is the military. Plato's enumeration of Atlantean armed forces is one of the most startling passages in ancient literature, not because the numbers are large, though they are almost incomprehensibly so, but because of the administrative precision with which they are laid out. As though someone had actually counted, the island could field 60,000 leaders of soldiers, 120,000 hoplites, 180,000 archers, 180,000 slingers, 300,000 stone throwers and javelin men, 2,000 horsemen, and 60,000 chariots. The naval forces comprised 1,200 ships, each carrying 200 men, meaning the Atlantean navy alone required a standing complement of 240,000 sailors, not counting officers, engineers, or support crews. When all branches are added together, Plato's Atlantis could put somewhere in the vicinity of 1 million men under arms, a figure that, for context, would not be matched by any European military force for another 2,000 years. And that implies a total civilian population numbering in the tens of millions. These numbers have been a persistent sticking point for serious historians, who note that sustaining a military force of this size would require agricultural and logistical infrastructure beyond anything that existed in the ancient Mediterranean world. Supporters of the narrative's historical basis argue that the numbers reflect accurate records preserved over millennia. Skeptics argue that they are precisely the kind of systematic, round-numbered exaggerations that Plato used elsewhere when constructing ideal or allegorical scenarios impressive enough to signal overwhelming power, too tidy to represent actual military roles. What made the whole system function, according to Plato, was the extraordinary natural abundance of the island and the sophisticated infrastructure that distributed that abundance across the empire. The fertile plains produced their 2 annual harvests, fed by winter rains and summer irrigation channeled through the great canal grid. The mountains provided timber for shipbuilding and stone for construction. The earth yielded orichalcum, copper, and other metals in quantities sufficient to armor walls and build fleets simultaneously. Wild animals grazed on hillsides wealthy enough to support both domestic herds and the hunting grounds where sacred bulls ran free. The island was, in Plato's telling, essentially self-sufficient at an imperial scale, not a civilization that had carved prosperity from difficult conditions through ingenuity and struggle, but one that had been handed abundance by the generosity of its geography and the blessing of its divine founder. This detail is philosophically significant in a way that is easy to miss on first reading. Plato consistently argued, in works ranging from the Republic to the Laws, that excessive material ease was one of the surest paths to moral corruption, that civilizations which did not have to fight for their prosperity had no internal mechanism to develop the virtues that prosperity alone could not provide. In this sense, the very richness of Atlantis was already the seed of its eventual destruction, planted by Poseidon himself in the moment he chose the most fertile, most beautiful, most naturally gifted island in the world as the home for his half-divine children. The gods, in Plato's moral universe, had a way of giving great gifts that were also, from a certain angle, slow catastrophes, and the early Atlanteans, still burning with the divine fire of their Poseidon heritage, had not yet lived long enough to understand what they had been given, or what it would eventually cost them. There is a moment in Plato's account when the entire narrative shifts register, when the inventory of harbours and military units and sacred rituals gives way to something more intimate and more devastating. It is the moment Plato describes the change that came over the Atlantean people across generations, the slow leaching away of what had made them extraordinary. And it reads less like ancient history than like a diagnosis of something Plato watched happening in real time to the city he loved and feared in equal measure. The early Atlanteans, he tells us, possessed a remarkable combination of qualities that rarely survive contact with power. They were wise without being arrogant, wealthy without being greedy, capable of enormous military force without being needlessly aggressive. Their divine heritage from Poseidon expressed itself in genuine nobility of character and natural orientation toward justice, a contempt for the vanity of excessive material display, a preference for virtue over the appearance of virtue. They were, in the language Plato used throughout his philosophical work, soul's properly ordered reason governing appetite, wisdom directing power, the higher functions of human nature in genuine command of the lower ones. This was not a stable condition. It never is. In Plato's understanding of how civilizations work, the divine element in the Atlanteans was real, but it was finite diluted with each generation as divine blood mixed further with mortal nature, until the original fire became something more like embers, and the embers began to cool. As the centuries accumulated and the human portion of their nature grew dominant, the Atlanteans changed, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with gathering speed, the things they had once treated with aristocratic indifference began to seem urgently important. Wealth, territory, status, the displays of power that their ancestors had regarded as vulgar, became the primary language through which they communicated their significance to one another and to the world. This transformation from virtue to corruption, from restraint to imperial appetite, is the philosophical core of Plato's entire Atlantis narrative. And understanding it requires understanding what Plato was watching when he looked out the windows of the Academy at the Athens of his own time. He had been born in approximately 428 years before the Christian era. Just 3 years into the Peloponnesian War, the catastrophic conflict between Athens and Sparta that consumed an entire generation shattered the Athenian Empire and ended the city's golden age with a finality that no subsequent recovery could fully disguise. He had watched Athens, the city that had stood at Marathon against Persian invasion and at Salamis against the Persian fleet, transform itself from the defender of Greek freedom into an aggressive imperial power that extracted tribute from its allies, executed philosophers who asked inconvenient questions, and launched catastrophic military adventures driven by the kind of hubris that Plato's entire philosophical project was designed to diagnose and cure. The Sicilian expedition of 415 BC, Athens' disastrous attempt to conquer Syracuse, which ended in the complete destruction of the expeditionary force and effectively broke Athenian naval supremacy, haunted Plato's political thinking, the way certain military disasters haunt the thinking of every writer who lived through them. When he described the Atlantean kings meeting to deliberate on their growing appetite for conquest, when he wrote of a civilization that had begun to prioritize the accumulation of power over the cultivation of wisdom, he was not writing about a mythological island 9,000 years in the past. He was writing about Athens. He was writing about what happens when a city mistakes its military and commercial success for moral superiority, and begins to believe that the rules governing lesser civilizations do not apply to it. The gods, in Plato's account, saw the change in the Atlanteans clearly, even as the Atlanteans themselves remained largely blind to it. Zeus, lord of the divine assembly, looked down at a people who had once been the finest expression of the marriage between mortal and divine nature, and saw instead a civilization that had become an embarrassment to its own origins, still magnificent in its material achievements, still awe-inspiring in its military power, but inwardly hollow, the gold facade concealing moral rot of a depth that made continued existence not just unjustified, but genuinely dangerous to the rest of the world. He called the gods together to deliberate, and here the Critias breaks off, mid-sentence, leaving the divine judgment unspoken and the punishment undescribed, the silence itself carrying a weight that 2.5 millennia of readers have found almost unbearable. We know from the Timaeus what the verdict was. The gods sent earthquakes and floods of supernatural violence, and in the space of a single day and night, Atlantis vanished beneath the waves. No ruins, no survivors carrying the full truth of what had existed, only the churned, impassable mud that choked the shallow sea where the island had been, and the Egyptian temple records that preserved the outline of the story for Solon to carry back to Athens centuries later. The precision of that destruction one day and one night is itself philosophically significant. It mirrors the speed with which Plato believed moral corruption, once fully established, could bring down even the most powerful structures that human ambition had built. The long decline was internal and invisible. The end, when it came, was total and instantaneous. Scholars have long debated whether Plato drew any of this from actual historical events rather than constructing the entire narrative from philosophical cloth. The Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 years before the Christian era, that still mysterious period when the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Ugaritic civilization, and several other sophisticated cultures simultaneously disintegrated within decades of each other, left memories of catastrophic civilizational destruction that may have survived in fragmented oral traditions long enough to influence later storytelling. The Theron volcanic eruption, the destructions visible in the archaeological record at sites like Mycenae and Tiryns, the sudden silence that falls over the Linear B tablet archives, these were real endings, experienced by real people who had children and grandchildren who remembered. Whether any of that memory found its way into Plato's account, filtered through Egyptian priests and Solon and Critias and generations of oral transmission, we genuinely cannot know. What we can say is that Plato constructed a story perfectly calibrated to do what he needed it to do, to make the abstract lesson about power and virtue and the inevitable consequences of moral decline feel as concrete, as visceral, and as inescapable as the ocean swallowing an island whole. The death of Plato in 347 years before the Christian era did not settle the question of Atlantis, it opened it. Within the intellectual communities that Plato had shaped and that would carry his influence forward across centuries, the story immediately became a problem that demanded a position. You could not simply nod at it politely and move on. The way one might acknowledge a decorative myth without taking it seriously, the Atlantis account was embedded in dialogues that Plato himself had presented as philosophically significant. Narrated through a chain of authority he had constructed with evident care, and filled with the kind of precise detail that demanded either engagement or explicit rejection. The first major voice to offer explicit rejection belonged to the most formidable intellect in the Academy's history, Aristotle, Plato's greatest student and, in many ways, his most consequential critic. Aristotle's dismissal of Atlantis has come down to us through later sources in the form of a single devastating observation that the man who invented Atlantis also conveniently caused it to disappear. The precision of this contempt is worth pausing over. Aristotle was not simply expressing skepticism about an unlikely story. He was making a methodological argument, pointing out that a narrative conveniently beyond the reach of verification, destroyed by its own creator at the moment of maximum rhetorical impact, failed to meet the basic evidentiary standards that any serious historical claim needed to satisfy. For Aristotle, who spent his career building the foundations of empirical investigation and insisting that knowledge had to be grounded in observable reality rather than philosophical convenience, the Atlantis narrative represented exactly the kind of fictional framework disguised as historical fact that corrupted serious inquiry. His dismissal was not casual, it was principled, and it reflected a fundamental disagreement with his teacher about the proper relationship between philosophical instruction and factual honesty. What makes Aristotle's rejection particularly significant is the intellectual authority it carried and the tradition of skepticism. It initiated a tradition that the rest of the ancient world, with remarkably few exceptions, chose to follow. The silence of other ancient writers on the subject of Atlantis is, in many ways, more eloquent than any explicit refutation could have been. Consider Herodotus. Writing his monumental histories roughly a generation before Plato composed the Timaeus and Critias, Herodotus was constitutionally incapable of ignoring a good story about distant lands and vanished civilizations. His work ranges from the customs of the Scythians to the religious practices of the Egyptians, from the geography of India to the legends of the Hyperboreans who supposedly lived beyond the North Wind. He documented traditions, rumors, and outright marvels with an enthusiasm that his more methodologically rigorous successors found embarrassing. He travelled to Egypt. He spoke with Egyptian priests. He was fascinated by the depth of Egyptian historical memory. And yet, nowhere in the entire sprawling, digressive, gloriously curious body of his work does a single word appear that corresponds to the story Plato would later claim those same Egyptian priests had shared with Solon. The absence is striking enough to require explanation. Either Herodotus encountered no tradition resembling the Atlantis account during his Egyptian travels, which strongly suggests the account did not exist in Egyptian temple archives, or he encountered it and judged it unworthy of inclusion, even by his generous standards. Neither explanation is comfortable for those who wish to treat Plato's narrative as genuine historical record. Thucydides presents an even sharper version of the same problem, where Herodotus was expansive and credulous. Thucydides was disciplined and demanding the first historian to apply something resembling modern source criticism to the events he described, insisting on eyewitness testimony, distinguishing carefully between what he knew and what he inferred, and treating the embellishments of earlier storytellers with barely concealed impatience. His account of the Peloponnesian War established standards for historical writing that would not be significantly surpassed for 2,000 years. In his compressed treatment of early Greek history, he discusses Athenian traditions, migration, ancient conflicts, and the development of Greek naval power, precisely the contexts in which a genuine tradition about an ancient Athenian victory over a Western maritime empire would have belonged. His silence on Atlantis in this context carries particular weight. Thucydides was proud of Athenian history. He would not have omitted a genuine tradition of Athens successfully defending the Mediterranean world against a vastly superior imperial enemy. The omission suggests he knew of no such tradition, which means the tradition almost certainly did not exist independently of Plato's account. Strabo, writing during the reign of Augustus Caesar, brought the resources of comprehensive Hellenistic geographical knowledge to bear on the problem and arrived at the same conclusion through a different route. His dismissal of Atlantis as Plato's invention was grounded in practical geographical analysis. The Atlantic Ocean had been explored by his era's navigators with sufficient thoroughness to make the existence of a continent-sized landmass implausible, and the claim about impassable mud shoals preventing later exploration contradicted the direct experience of sailors who had successfully navigated those waters. Strabo was not a philosopher making an argument about allegorical intent. He was a geographer, applying the knowledge of his age to a geographical claim and finding it wanting. The Roman intellectual tradition confirmed and extended this ancient verdict. Livy's monumental history incorporated Greek traditions freely when they served his purposes, and Tacitus demonstrated throughout his career a sophisticated interest in the relationship between geography, power, and cultural character. Neither found occasion to mention Atlantis. Despite covering periods and themes where a genuine ancient tradition about the lost civilization would have been directly relevant, the contrast with the Roman reception of other Platonic ideas is instructive. Roman intellectuals eagerly absorbed Platonic political philosophy, cosmological speculation, and educational theory. The Atlantis narrative, uniquely, failed to gain any traction in Roman historical or geographical writing, a selective omission that speaks volumes about how educated Romans understood the story's status. What emerges from surveying the ancient world's response to Plato's account is a picture of near universal intellectual consensus that Atlantis was a philosophical construction rather than a historical report, a consensus reached not through coordinated rejection, but through the simple, powerful mechanism of writers who took history seriously, declining to treat the story as history. The ancient world had its credulities and its mythologies, its lost golden ages and its legendary founders. It chose, with remarkable consistency, not to add Atlantis to that list. The centuries immediately following Atlantis's cool reception in the ancient world might have buried the story permanently, consigned it to the footnotes of Platonic scholarship, a curious philosophical device noted and set aside by serious thinkers with more pressing questions to resolve. What prevented that outcome was a revolution in how educated people read Plato entirely, beginning in the 3rd century of the Christian era. A school of thought emerged that would transform Platonic philosophy from a system of rational argument into something closer to a sacred tradition, a body of revealed wisdom that encoded profound metaphysical truths in layered allegorical structures that only the properly initiated could fully penetrate. This movement, known to history as Neoplatonism, did not merely rehabilitate the Atlantis narrative, it elevated it, wrapped it in cosmic significance, and set it on a trajectory that would carry it through the medieval world and into the Renaissance imagination with an authority it had never possessed in Plato's own lifetime. The architect of this transformation was Plotinus, the Egyptian-born philosopher who taught in Rome during the 3rd century and whose Enneads established the intellectual framework through which subsequent generations would read Plato's dialogues. But it was Proclus, the 5th century Athenian, who headed the Platonic Academy, and whose commentary on the Timaeus runs to several dense volumes, who gave the Atlantis narrative its most elaborate Neoplatonic treatment. Proclus approached the story with a fundamental conviction that Plato never wrote anything merely for entertainment or simple illustration, that every element of every dialogue operated simultaneously on multiple levels of meaning, and that the surface narrative of historical events concealed deeper truths about the structure of reality itself. In this interpretive framework, the conflict between Athens and Atlantis became a cosmic drama, the eternal struggle between intellectual principle and material appetite, between the soul oriented toward transcendent truth and the soul seduced by the glittering surfaces of physical existence. What Proclus accomplished with this reading was intellectually elegant and historically consequential in equal measure. By relocating the story's primary significance from the literal to the allegorical register, he freed the Atlantis narrative from the geographical and chronological difficulties that had troubled its earlier critics. It no longer mattered that no contemporary explorer had found an island continent in the Atlantic, or that no independent historical source corroborated the account of an ancient Athenian victory over a Western empire. These were objections to the surface narrative, and the surface narrative was not where the truth lived. The truth lived in the symbolic structure, and on that level, Proclus argued, the story was not just plausible but demonstrably accurate, a precise mapping of cosmological principles onto historical narrative. This interpretive move had enormous staying power, partly because it was genuinely sophisticated, and partly because it provided a template for accommodating any inconvenient discrepancy between the story and observable reality. The approach proved influential among later medieval and Renaissance readers who inherited Neoplatonic methods of reading classical texts and applied them with varying degrees of rigor to the Atlantis account. The encounter between Atlantis and early Christian thought was considerably more fraught. Christian writers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries faced a structural problem that Neoplatonic philosophers had not needed to address the story's chronology. Plato's dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 years before his own era placed these events roughly 11,800 years before the Christian era, a time frame that sat in irreconcilable tension with biblical chronologies that placed the creation of humanity only a few thousand years before Christ. A civilization of extraordinary sophistication flourishing more than 10 millennia before Abraham was not simply historically inconvenient, it was theologically explosive. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 years after Christ in the intellectually sophisticated environment of Egypt's great city, attempted a characteristically Alexandrian solution: careful, learned, and ultimately more creative than convincing. He argued that Egyptian chronological systems suffered from systematic errors that made ancient events appear far more remote than they actually were, and that by correcting these errors and aligning Egyptian timelines with biblical frameworks, the Atlantis story might be accommodated within sacred history rather than contradicting it. This harmonizing impulse reflected the broader Alexandrian project of reconciling Greek philosophical wisdom with Christian revelation, treating them not as competitors but as complementary approaches to the same ultimate truth. Augustine of Hippo, writing 2 centuries later from a position of greater theological confidence and considerably less patience for Greek philosophical sophistication, took a more direct approach. His treatment of Atlantis in the City of God acknowledged the story's allegorical power, the rise and fall of a civilization corrupted by pride and materialism, mapped neatly onto Augustinian theology's understanding of the earthly city while maintaining careful distance from any claim about its literal accuracy. For Augustine, the story was potentially useful as moral illustration, but epistemologically unreliable as history. And conflating those two categories was precisely the kind of intellectual confusion that his theological project was designed to prevent. The broader Christian tradition that emerged from these early engagements tended toward a similar position: Atlantis as cautionary tale, potentially edifying, historically doubtful, chronologically impossible without significant reinterpretation. Then came the silence, one of the most remarkable silences in Western intellectual history. Between roughly the 5th century and the mid-15th century, a span of approximately 1,000 years, the Atlantis narrative effectively vanished from European consciousness. The mechanism was straightforward, but its consequences were profound. The manuscript tradition that preserved Plato's complete works deteriorated catastrophically during the disruptions of the post-Roman period. Monastic scriptoria, working with severely limited resources and clear priorities centered on Christian texts, could not preserve everything, and the complete Timaeus and Critias, requiring not just Greek literacy, but sophisticated philosophical and geographical background to even make sense of, fell through the cracks of cultural transmission. The partial Latin translation that Chalcidius had made in the 4th century preserved roughly a third of the Timaeus, but ended precisely at the point where Plato begins his detailed description of Atlantis, leaving medieval readers tantalizing proximity to the story without access to its substance. Charlemagne's scholars, working heroically to recover classical knowledge in the 8th and 9th centuries, had no access to the complete Platonic corpus. Thomas Aquinas, whose encyclopedic synthesis of classical philosophy and Christian theology in the 13th century engaged deeply with Aristotle, made only passing references to Plato and showed no knowledge whatsoever of the Atlantis account. For 1,000 years, one of the most captivating stories the ancient world had produced sat in darkness, waiting for the moment when the manuscripts would be found again and the world would be ready to receive them in an entirely different spirit. History has a dramatic sense of timing that occasionally borders on the theatrical. Consider the following sequence of events in 1453. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople, ending 11 centuries of Byzantine civilization in a single catastrophic afternoon. Among the refugees who streamed westward in the weeks and months that followed were Greek scholars carrying manuscript collections that had survived in Eastern libraries while their Western counterparts had been lost to the chaos of the post-Roman centuries. These manuscripts included, among many other treasures, complete versions of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias among them, containing the full Atlantis narrative in its original Greek for the first time, available to Western European scholars in roughly 1,000 years. Within a decade of Constantinople's fall, a Florentine scholar named Marsilio Ficino had begun the project that would make these recovered texts available to the entire educated world. And within 40 years, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus would sail west from the Spanish port of Palos into the same Atlantic Ocean that Plato had identified as the location of the lost civilization, and return with news that changed everything. The chronological convergence of these three events, the recovery of Plato's complete works, their translation into Latin, and the European discovery of the Americas is not coincidental in any supernatural sense, but it is genuinely extraordinary in its consequences. The Atlantis narrative returned to European consciousness at precisely the moment when the geographical assumptions embedded in it were about to be shattered and rebuilt from scratch, creating interpretive possibilities that no previous era could have imagined. Marsilio Ficino worked under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, the banker prince whose extraordinary cultural ambitions had made Florence the intellectual capital of the 15th century world. Cosimo had reportedly instructed Ficino to set aside his translation of Plato's complete works in favour of completing it before he died. Such was his eagerness to read the recovered dialogues in a language he could access. Ficino's translation project, completed around 1484, was a monument of Renaissance scholarship rigorous in its philological attention, infused with the Neoplatonic enthusiasm that Ficino brought to everything he touched, and accompanied by commentaries that shaped how educated Europeans would read these texts for generations. His approach to the Atlantis narrative reflected his deep commitment to the tradition flowing from Plotinus and Proclus. He understood the story not as simple fiction or literal history, but as a complex philosophical allegory that encoded truths about human nature and divine providence in narrative form. The moral dimensions of the account, the early Atlanteans' virtue, the gradual corruption of their divine heritage, the catastrophic divine judgment aligned perfectly with Ficino's Neoplatonic conviction that material prosperity untethered from spiritual wisdom inevitably destroyed itself. In his reading, Atlantis was not a curiosity from ancient geography. It was a lesson about the structure of the human soul and the consequences of allowing its lower nature to dominate its higher capacities, dressed in the most compelling narrative clothing Plato had ever produced. The Medici court that received Ficino's translations was perhaps the single most receptive intellectual environment in Western history for a story like Atlantis. The Florentine humanists who gathered under Cosimo's patronage and later under Lorenzo the Magnificent were acutely conscious of their own relationship to classical antiquity. They understood themselves as the heirs of a great, civilization whose wisdom had been lost and needed recovery, as restorers of an intellectual tradition that the medieval centuries had allowed to decay. The parallel between their own project and Plato's account of ancient wisdom preserved in Egyptian temples resonated with a force that was almost personal. They were doing, in their own way, what the Egyptian priests had done, maintaining the thread of genuine knowledge across a period of cultural darkness, keeping it available for the moment when the world was ready to receive it again. Pico della Mirandola, whose oration on the dignity of man articulated the Renaissance's most confident declaration of human potential, found in the Atlantis narrative a mythological complement to his philosophical themes, the early Atlanteans exemplifying exactly the human dignity that Pico celebrated, their decline illustrating exactly the self-betrayal that Pico warned against. This thematic convergence helped establish Atlantis as a central reference point for Renaissance discussions about the possibilities and limitations of human civilization. Not a geographical curiosity, but a philosophical resource that illuminated questions the humanists found urgently relevant to their own moment. The printing revolution accelerated everything. Ficino's Latin translation, first circulated in manuscript among Florentine scholars, reached print in 1484, and the subsequent decades saw it disseminated across Europe with a speed that the manuscript tradition could never have achieved. The 1491 Venetian edition produced by Aldus Manutius, the great printer whose Aldine press became synonymous with the highest standards of Renaissance book production, brought Plato's complete works to educated audiences from London to Krakow, from Lisbon to Vienna, ending the millennium-long absence of the Atlantis story from European intellectual discourse with a definitiveness that no subsequent development could reverse. Within a generation, university students, court intellectuals, theologians, and natural philosophers across the continent had access to the full narrative that their medieval predecessors had known only in fragments and rumours. The timing, as noted, was extraordinary. Columbus returned from his first Atlantic voyage in 1493, 9 years after Ficino's translation appeared in print. The educated Europeans who read his account of lands beyond the Western Ocean were simultaneously reading, for the first time in 1,000 years, Plato's description of a great civilization that had existed beyond the same ocean. The interpretive pressure this created was immense, immediate, and would shape the next 2 centuries of Atlantis speculation in ways that neither Plato nor Ficino could possibly have anticipated. A story that had been a philosophical allegory for Athenian readers, a cosmic drama for Neoplatonic mystics, and a theological puzzle for Christian scholars was about to become something it had never previously been, a potential historical explanation for the most disorienting geographical discovery in European history. When Hernan Cortés entered Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, he walked into a city that stopped him cold. This was a man who had already seen the great cities of Spain and Cuba, who was not easily impressed by human achievement, and whose letters back to the Spanish crown are remarkable documents of strategic intelligence and ruthless calculation rather than wide-eyed wonder. Yet his description of the Aztec capital is saturated with a disbelief that he cannot quite suppress a sense that what he was looking at should not exist, that no category available to him adequately contained what his eyes were reporting. The city sat on an island in the middle of a vast lake, connected to the surrounding mainland by broad causeways wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast. It was laced with canals navigable by canoes, its markets stocked with goods from across the known world, its temples rising in stepped pyramids that caught the morning light above the lake's surface like geometric mountains. Its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands, comparable to the largest cities in Europe, and organized with an administrative efficiency that the Spanish, who had come expecting savagery, found genuinely disorienting. Among the educated Europeans who read Cortés' letters in the 1520s and 1530s, many of them freshly acquainted with Ficino's translation of Plato's dialogues, the reaction was immediate and electric. The island city, the causeways, the canals, the extraordinary wealth, the massive temples, the sophisticated governance. The parallels to Plato's description of the Atlantean capital were not vague thematic resonances, they were specific, structural, and almost point by point, convincing to minds already primed to see them. Francisco López de Gómara, who served as Cortés's personal chaplain and later wrote the first comprehensive history of the Spanish conquests, made the connection explicit in his Historia de las Indias, published in 1552. He argued directly that the advanced civilizations the conquistadors had encountered in the Americas provided concrete historical evidence for the existence of the civilization. Plato had described that the Aztec Empire, the Maya, and the various other sophisticated indigenous cultures were either the descendants of Atlantean survivors or the inheritors of knowledge that Atlantean refugees had carried westward before the final catastrophe. The geographical argument supporting this identification seemed, to Renaissance eyes, almost irresistibly logical. Plato had placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the ocean that lay to the west of the Mediterranean world. The Americas were precisely there beyond those same pillars, in that same ocean, on a scale of territory that matched Plato's claim about Atlantis being larger than Libya and Asia combined. The Atlantic Ocean, which Plato had described as rendered impassable by mud and shoals after the island's destruction, separated the known world from these newly discovered lands in exactly the geographical relationship his account required. For scholars who wanted to believe in a historical Atlantis, the Americas seemed less like a coincidence and more like a confirmation that had been waiting patiently for European ships to find it. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, who spent decades in the New World documenting indigenous cultures and natural phenomena with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood he was witnessing something historically unique, developed these parallels with greater specificity than López de Gómara's broad strokes had allowed. In his Historias Generales y Naturales de las Indias, Oviedo identified numerous correspondences between Plato's account and observed American characteristics, similarities in metallurgical techniques, agricultural practices involving the cultivation of crops through elaborate irrigation systems, and architectural styles that employed massive stone construction without iron tools, achieving precision that European engineers found both admirable and inexplicable. The Aztec hydraulic engineering that had transformed the shallow lake around Tenochtitlan into a managed system of chinampas, the famous floating gardens that dramatically extended the city's agricultural capacity, provided a striking parallel to Plato's description of Atlantean Canal, systems feeding 2 annual harvests from a rationally organized plain. The precision stonework of Inca construction in the Andes, fitting massive blocks together without mortar, with an accuracy that a blade of grass could not penetrate, seemed to echo the engineering sophistication that Plato had attributed to the builders of Atlantis's concentric harbour walls. These were not superficial resemblances, they were functional similarities, 2 civilizations independently solving similar problems of hydraulic engineering, mass construction, and agricultural management, with techniques that produced comparable results, and to Renaissance observers lacking the analytical frameworks that later archaeology would develop. Independent invention seemed a far less economical explanation than common origin. José de Acosta's Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, published in 1590, attempted to place these parallels within a more methodologically careful framework than his predecessors had employed. Acosta was a Jesuit with genuine intellectual rigor, and he recognized that explaining American civilizations as direct descendants of Atlantean survivors created chronological problems that straightforward enthusiasm tended to gloss over. His solution was a migration theory. The Americas had been populated by successive waves of peoples from the Old World, some of whom might have carried memories or techniques originating in ancient civilizations that eventually influenced indigenous American cultures without requiring direct historical continuity. This mechanism allowed him to acknowledge the apparent parallels without committing to the full Atlantis identification, creating a more cautious interpretive position that nonetheless kept the connection alive as a genuine historical possibility rather than dismissing it entirely. The chronological difficulties were real and significant. Plato's dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 years before his own era placed the civilization roughly 11,500 years in the past, a time frame that sat awkwardly with both biblical chronology and with the evident antiquity of the American civilizations that the Spanish were documenting, which archaeological evidence, even then, suggested were considerably more recent than Plato's dates required. Some scholars propose that Plato had misunderstood Egyptian chronological conventions, confusing lunar months with solar years in a way that would reduce his 9,000 years to a more historically manageable 900. Others suggested that the story referred to more recent events that oral transmission had artificially antiquated. None of these solutions was entirely satisfying, but all of them kept the question open, and in intellectual history, a question kept open is a question that continues to generate answers, each one drawing the next generation of curious minds into a labyrinth that Plato had built 2,000 years before anyone suspected how many rooms it contained. The 17th century inherited the Atlantis question from the Renaissance, in a condition of productive confusion energized by the Americas connection, complicated by chronological difficulties, and increasingly subject to the pressure of a new intellectual movement that was beginning to insist, with gathering confidence, that ancient authorities should be evaluated by evidence rather than venerated by tradition. The scientific revolution had not yet fully dismantled the old hierarchies of knowledge, but it had introduced a methodological restlessness, a habit of asking not just what authorities had claimed, but what observable reality could confirm, that would eventually transform every field of human inquiry, including the investigation of ancient history. Into this environment stepped Olaf Rudbeck, and the story of what he built and why he built it tells us as much about the psychology of Atlantis scholarship as it does about 17th century Sweden. Rudbeck was not a crank or a dilettante. He held the chair of medicine at Uppsala University, had made genuine contributions to the understanding of the lymphatic system, and possessed a formidable intellect capable of sustained, rigorous inquiry across multiple disciplines simultaneously. When he turned that intellect toward Atlantis, he produced something that was simultaneously one of the most ambitious works of scholarship in the century and one of the most spectacular examples in intellectual history of a brilliant mind in the service of a predetermined conclusion. His Atlantica, published in 4 volumes between 1679 and 1722, ran to thousands of pages of philological analysis, archaeological inventory, geographical argument, and linguistic comparison, all directed toward a single thesis that Sweden was Plato's Atlantis, that the Baltic Sea was the ocean Plato had described, and that Swedish civilization was the original mother culture from which all subsequent human achievement had descended. The philological foundation of Rudbeck's argument rested on a chain of etymological transformations that traced the name Atlantis through various linguistic mutations to Atland, which he interpreted as an ancient designation for Swedish territory. From this linguistic kernel he expanded outward, arguing that the Pillars of Hercules in Plato's account referred not to the Strait of Gibraltar, but to some northern geographical feature, possibly the narrow passages between Danish islands or the entrance to the Baltic Sea, and that classical geographers had systematically mislocated Plato's descriptions through their ignorance of Nordic geography. The archaeological evidence he marshalled drew on Sweden's genuine Bronze Age heritage, the burial mounds scattered across the Swedish landscape, the intricate metalwork found in grave deposits, the evidence of sophisticated trade connections reaching across northern Europe and beyond. To Rudbeck's eyes, these material remains demonstrated a level of ancient sophistication and international engagement that matched Plato's descriptions of Atlantean wealth and influence. The geographical features of Sweden and its surrounding regions provided him with structural parallels to Plato's account, the archipelago systems along Sweden's eastern coast echoing the concentric rings of land and water, the lake systems of the interior suggesting the canal networks that Plato attributed to Atlantean agriculture, Rudbeck's understanding of post-glacial geological processes, which represented genuinely cutting-edge scientific knowledge for his era, allowed him to argue that the Baltic region had undergone dramatic changes since ancient times, land elevation and sea level fluctuations, transforming geographical relationships in ways that explained why contemporary Scandinavia no longer matched Plato's descriptions exactly while preserving enough similarity to reveal the underlying correspondence. The political dimension of Rudbeck's project deserves as much attention as its scholarly methodology, because understanding what Sweden was in 1679 illuminates why such an argument found a receptive audience beyond the university walls. The Swedish Empire under Charles XI had reached an unprecedented territorial extent, controlling substantial portions of the Baltic coastline and asserting influence across northern Europe with a military confidence that would not survive the reign of Charles XII, but that in Rudbeck's lifetime felt like the natural expression of a civilization coming into its rightful inheritance, identifying Sweden as the original Atlantis, the mother of all civilizations, the source from which Greek and Egyptian and Near Eastern cultures had ultimately derived their wisdom and their institutional forms, provided historical justification for Swedish dominance that no military victory alone could have furnished. It was cultural imperialism pursued through philology, and its appeal to educated Swedish readers who wanted to believe their nation's current prominence reflected something deeper than recent military success was considerable and entirely understandable. The contemporary critical response to Rudbeck focused primarily on his philological methods rather than his archaeological evidence. Because 17th century archaeology lacked the rigorous standards that would have allowed systemic evaluation of his material claims, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, whose admiration for Rudbeck's erudition was genuine, nonetheless expressed principled skepticism about the etymological connections that formed the argument's foundation, noting, with the precision of a man who had himself worked extensively with language, that similar methods could be used to connect virtually any modern language with any ancient term, making conclusions reached through such analysis essentially unfalsifiable. This critique identified the central methodological problem with Rudbeck's entire enterprise in the absence of systematic linguistic science. The etymological connections he proposed could neither be definitively confirmed nor definitively refuted, leaving his argument in the epistemological limbo of the impressively constructed but ultimately unverifiable. French scholars of the early 18th century approached the Atlantis question from a different angle, one shaped by the emerging influence of mathematical reasoning and early geological theory on historical inquiry. Philippe Buache, a mathematician and geographer working in Paris around 1737, proposed that Atlantis had been located in the North Atlantic region, possibly corresponding to submerged land masses between Europe and North America, and produced detailed cartographic representations of his theory maps, showing hypothetical ancient Atlantic land configurations based on available knowledge of ocean depths and geological processes. Voltaire's engagement with Atlantis, characteristically, took the form of systematic demolition rather than elaboration. His treatment in the Essai sur les mœurs subjected Plato's account to rational analysis that highlighted its internal inconsistencies and evidentiary isolation with the sharp, slightly contemptuous clarity that was his trademark intellectual register. The methodological innovations of 18th century historiography, culminating in Edward Gibbon's demonstration that careful source criticism could reveal the historical accuracy or inaccuracy of ancient claims with unprecedented precision, created new tools for evaluating the Atlantis narrative that consistently highlighted the same fundamental problem, a story found in exactly one ancient author, corroborated by no independent source, located in a region that expanding exploration was revealing with increasing detail and finding empty of any trace of the civilization Plato had described. There are moments in intellectual history when a single book changes not just what people think, but how they think. When a work arrives at precisely the right cultural moment to crystallize anxieties and aspirations that had been circulating without adequate expression, and in crystallizing them, makes them permanent. Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. published in 1882, was exactly that kind of book. It did not merely revive interest in a philosophical dialogue that had been generating scholarly debate for 2 millennia. It fundamentally restructured the popular understanding of human prehistory, established interpretive frameworks and evidentiary standards that would define alternative archaeology as a genre for more than a century, and created a mythological template for lost civilization, thinking that persists with remarkable vitality in the present day. Understanding why requires understanding not just what Donnelly argued, but who Donnelly was, because the antediluvian world is inseparable from the personality and the cultural position of the man who wrote it. Born in Philadelphia in 1831, Donnelly had built his career not in university libraries, but in the rough-and-tumble arena of American populist politics, 3 terms in the United States House of Representatives, a stint as lieutenant governor of Minnesota, and a sustained career as a political agitator, championing ordinary farmers and workers against the entrenched economic power of railroads and banks. When he turned his formidable rhetorical gifts toward ancient history, he brought to the subject the same combative outsider energy that had characterized his political work, positioning himself explicitly as a truth-teller, challenging the dogmas of academic establishments that, in his telling, protected their institutional authority by dismissing evidence that threatened their comfortable assumptions. The intellectual climate of 1882 was precisely calibrated to receive what Donnelly was offering: Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, had shattered the biblical framework within which most educated Westerners had previously understood human origins, creating both the necessity and the opportunity for comprehensive new narratives about humanity's deep past. Archaeological discoveries across Europe, Egypt, and the Americas were revealing sophisticated ancient civilizations that challenged simplistic, progressive assumptions about the linear development of human capability. The general educated public literate, curious, increasingly skeptical of both religious orthodoxy and academic specialization, was hungry for synthetic accounts that could make sense of these accumulating discoveries within a coherent framework. Donnelly's central thesis was breathtaking in its scope and simplicity. Plato's Atlantis had been a real historical civilization, destroyed approximately 11,000 years ago by a catastrophic geological event, whose scattered survivors had carried advanced knowledge and cultural practices to every inhabited corner of the globe, establishing the foundations for all subsequent human civilizations from Egypt to Mexico, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The remarkable similarities observable between ancient cultures separated by vast geographical distances, pyramid construction, flood myths, astronomical knowledge, metallurgical techniques were not the products of independent human ingenuity or gradual cultural diffusion. They were the fragmentary residue of a common Atlantean heritage, preserved imperfectly across millennia of transmission, but still recognizable to anyone with eyes trained to see the pattern beneath the surface variation. The methodology Donnelly employed to construct this argument was simultaneously his greatest strength as a popular writer and his most fundamental weakness as a historical thinker. He demonstrated extraordinary industry in gathering comparative material. His 500-page volume is dense with citations drawn from archaeology, ethnography, geology, comparative mythology, botany, zoology, and linguistics, covering cultures from every inhabited continent and historical period. The sheer accumulation of apparent parallels was genuinely impressive, and for readers without specialized knowledge of any of the individual fields he was drawing upon, the cumulative weight of so many apparent correspondences felt like evidence of a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. His treatment of flood myths was representative of both the appeal and the problem of his approach. He compiled narratives of worldwide catastrophic floods from cultures across the globe: Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Aztec, Norse, Chinese, noting their apparent similarities and arguing that all preserved distorted memories of the actual destruction of Atlantis, transmitted through oral traditions by scattered survivors who had witnessed the catastrophe. What this analysis consistently ignored was the fundamental differences between these narratives, differences in the identity and motivation of divine agents, in the means of survival, in the geographical scope of the destruction, and in the cultural functions served by the flood story within each tradition. These differences, which any serious comparative mythologist would have treated as primary evidence about independent origin, Donnelly dismissed as minor corruptions introduced during centuries of oral transmission, a methodological convenience that allowed him to treat wildly divergent materials as variations on a single theme. The architectural parallels Donnelly drew between pyramid-building cultures on different continents became perhaps the most enduringly influential element of his argument, not because they were methodologically sound, which they were not, but because pyramids are visually spectacular, emotionally compelling, and genuinely mysterious to non-specialist audiences in ways that pottery sequences and stratigraphic profiles are not. His observation that both ancient Egyptians and various Mesoamerican civilizations had built massive stepped stone structures using sophisticated engineering without iron tools seemed, to readers, innocent of archaeological context, to demand explanation beyond independent invention. Professional archaeologists recognized immediately that Egyptian and Mesoamerican pyramids differed fundamentally in their construction techniques, internal structure, cultural function, and historical development, that the similarities Donnelly identified were superficial convergences produced by the limited engineering solutions available to any pre-industrial civilization attempting to build monumental structures from stone, not evidence of shared cultural ancestry. But Donnelly was not writing for professional archaeologists. He was writing for the same audience that had elected him to congresspeople who trusted vivid argument and accumulated example over technical qualification and methodological caution, and who found in his grand unified theory of human prehistory a satisfaction that fragmented specialist knowledge could not provide. The book went through multiple editions and translations within years of its publication, reaching audiences across Europe and America and establishing Donnelly as the founding figure of a popular alternative history tradition that would generate an unbroken succession of followers, imitators, and elaborators across the following century and beyond. Whatever its scholarly failings, and they were fundamental, the antediluvian world accomplished something that no academic treatment of Atlantis had ever managed. It made the lost civilization feel not like a philosopher's thought, experiment, but like a missing chapter of human history that everyone deserved to know. Donnelly had argued that Atlantis was history. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky argued that it was something far more significant than that, a stage in the cosmic evolution of the human soul, a chapter in a story so vast that ordinary historical categories could barely contain it, and a civilization whose true significance could only be grasped by minds trained in traditions of esoteric wisdom that mainstream scholarship had either lost or deliberately suppressed. Where Donnelly's Atlantis was archaeological, Blavatsky's was metaphysical. Where his lost civilization explained the distribution of pyramid construction and flood mythology, hers explained the structure of the universe and the purpose of human existence. The ambition of the upgrade was breathtaking, and the timing was perfect. The 1880s and 1890s were decades of profound spiritual restlessness in Western intellectual culture, decades when the collapse of traditional Christian certainty under the combined pressure of Darwinian biology and biblical criticism had left educated people who still felt the pull of transcendence without an adequate institutional home for it. Blavatsky, a Russian aristocrat of extraordinary personal magnetism and equally extraordinary intellectual audacity, had founded the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875 with the explicit purpose of filling exactly that vacuum, offering a synthesis of Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and speculative science that promised access to truths deeper than either orthodox religion or materialist science could provide. Her monumental work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, was the fullest expression of this project, and Atlantis occupied a central position within it, not as a lost civilization that archaeology might one day recover, but as a cosmic fact about the structure of human evolution that only those with access to sources beyond ordinary scholarship could know. The theoretical framework that Blavatsky constructed for her Atlantis teachings centered on the doctrine of root races, a cosmological scheme in which humanity progresses through 7 distinct evolutionary stages, each representing a fundamentally different expression of human physical, mental, and spiritual nature, occurring over geological timescales that dwarfed anything conventional history contemplated. The Atlanteans were the 4th root race, inhabiting the Earth during a period when the planet's geography, climate, and spiritual conditions differed so dramatically from contemporary circumstances that direct comparison between their world and ours required imagination of a genuinely radical kind. These were not simply ancient people living without modern technology. They were beings of a different order of consciousness possessing natural psychic abilities that allowed direct communion with spiritual hierarchies, perception of subtle energies invisible to ordinary human senses, and technological capabilities that operated through spiritual rather than mechanical principles. Their cities were not built with iron tools and slave labor, but through the manipulation of forces that modern science had not yet discovered. Their vehicles did not burn fuel, but drew on subtle cosmic energies focused through crystals and directed by trained will. Their social organization required no external laws or enforcement mechanisms because natural telepathic transparency made deception essentially impossible. Leaders were recognized by the direct perception of their spiritual development, rather than elected by majorities or appointed by hereditary succession. Blavatsky's claimed source for all this was not archaeological inference or textual analysis, but direct access to the Akashic records, a cosmic repository of all human experience, accessible through advanced spiritual development combined with communications from Mahatmas, ascended masters who guided human evolution from hidden retreats in the Himalayas and who had chosen Blavatsky as their instrument for transmitting ancient wisdom to a Western world that had lost its connection to these deeper sources of knowledge. The narrative of Atlantean decline and destruction that Blavatsky presented followed the same broad moral arc as Plato's account, while amplifying every element to cosmic scale. The early Atlanteans, burning with divine fire and naturally oriented towards spiritual service, had used their extraordinary capabilities for the elevation of all consciousness. Their civilization, a genuine partnership between human aspiration and divine guidance. Their achievements reflecting the harmonious functioning of a society in which material and spiritual development proceeded together, rather than in the dangerous separation that characterized later periods. As the root race progressed through its evolutionary cycle, later generations lost their natural spiritual perception while retaining dangerous technical capabilities, a combination Blavatsky identified as the most consistently destructive pattern in cosmic history, the engine behind every great civilizational collapse. Secret societies emerged within Atlantean society, preserving occult knowledge for selfish purposes rather than cosmic service, practicing what Blavatsky called black magic, the use of spiritual forces to dominate and exploit rather than to serve and elevate. The accumulation of this spiritual corruption attracted destructive cosmic consequences, and the final submersion of Atlantis beneath the ocean represented simultaneously a natural geological process and a spiritual cleansing, the removal of a civilization whose continued existence would have actively hindered the evolutionary development of the human species. Rudolf Steiner, who had been associated with the Theosophical Society before founding his own Anthroposophical Society in 1913, built upon Blavatsky's foundations while bringing to them a background in German idealist philosophy and a claimed capacity for precise clairvoyant investigation that he believed allowed him to examine past evolutionary periods with something approaching scientific rigor. His account of Atlantean civilization emphasized the fundamental difference between ancient and modern consciousness in ways that Blavatsky's more dramatic narrative had not fully developed. The Atlanteans, in Steiner's telling, possessed a dreamlike awareness that provided direct access to spiritual realities while lacking the sharp intellectual discrimination that characterized post-Atlantean thinking. They experienced the physical world as fluid, malleable rather than fixed and mechanical, which allowed them to work with natural forces in ways that modern consciousness, locked within rigid conceptual frameworks, could no longer achieve. Their agriculture operated through direct influence on plant growth rather than through mechanical cultivation. Their medicine worked through conscious direction of life forces rather than through chemical intervention. Their relationship to the natural world was participatory rather than exploitative, a genuine partnership between human intention and natural process that the post-Atlantean emphasis on intellectual mastery and mechanical control had progressively destroyed. What both Blavatsky and Steiner accomplished, regardless of the evidentiary status of their specific claims, was the transformation of Atlantis into a vehicle for articulating profound anxieties about what modernity had lost in its rush toward material progress and rational control. Their spiritual Atlantis was not simply a more spectacular version of Donnelly's archaeological one, it was a fundamentally different kind of argument, addressed to a fundamentally different kind of question. Donnelly had asked where civilization came from. Blavatsky and Steiner were asking what civilization was, for what human existence meant in a universe that materialism rendered silent and purposeless, and whether the technological achievements that were remaking the 19th century world represented genuine human progress or a particularly sophisticated form of spiritual self-abandonment. Atlantis, in their hands, became the mirror in which these questions could be examined with the emotional intensity that abstract philosophical argument rarely generated, a lost golden age whose destruction encoded lessons about the relationship between power and wisdom that every subsequent civilization had failed to learn with sufficient seriousness. There is something distinctly American about Edgar Cayce, something in the combination of practical ordinariness and extraordinary claimed gifts that could only have produced the particular cultural phenomenon he became in the soil of early 20th century Middle America. He was a photographer from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, with no formal education beyond the 9th grade, no training in history or archaeology or medicine, and no apparent ambition beyond living a quietly devout Christian life in the tradition of his rural Protestant upbringing. And yet, between 1923 and 1944, he delivered over 14,000 documented reading sessions conducted while lying in a self-induced trance state, during which he spoke with calm authority about subjects ranging from individual medical conditions to past life histories to the deep prehistory of human civilization that would make him the most influential single source of Atlantis mythology in the 20th century, and one of the foundational figures of the movement that would eventually call itself New Age. The Atlantis material in Cayce's readings did not emerge all at once or as a single coherent narrative. It accumulated across 2 decades of readings, building detail by detail into a comprehensive account that combined elements drawn from Blavatsky's theosophical framework, Donnelly's archaeological speculation, and a genuinely distinctive American metaphysical tradition that blended Christian themes of redemption and spiritual warfare with the reincarnation concepts that Cayce had absorbed from his engagement with theosophical literature. The result was an Atlantis unlike any previous version, simultaneously more specific and more emotionally immediate than its predecessors, anchored in the personal spiritual histories of individual people who Cayce told had lived previous lives on the lost continent, and therefore carrying a kind of intimacy that grand cosmological schemes rarely achieved. The civilization Cayce described spanned a period from approximately 200,000 to 10,000 years before the Christian era, a time frame that dwarfed even Blavatsky's already expansive geological chronology and placed Atlantean development across epochs that conventional archaeology associated not with civilization, but with early stone tool cultures and the first tentative migrations of anatomically modern humans across the globe. During this vast span, Cayce's readings described 3 major periods of destruction caused by the misuse of advanced technology, each one catastrophic enough to fundamentally alter the continent's geography, with the third and final cataclysm around 10,500 years before the Christian era, completing the submersion that left the Atlantic Ocean where a populated continent had been. The technology at the center of Cayce's Atlantis was crystals specifically, a device he called the Great Crystal or the Tuaoi stone, a massive instrument capable of concentrating solar and cosmic energies for practical applications, ranging from powering vehicles and providing illumination to facilitating long-distance communication and performing healing operations that modern medicine would have classified as miraculous. This crystal technology was not metaphorical or spiritual in Casey's account. It was presented as a literal engineering achievement, a physical device whose operating principles were simply unknown to contemporary science, rather than supernatural in any mystical sense. The Atlanteans had discovered and applied forces that human civilization would need to rediscover, and the Great Crystal was the most powerful expression of that knowledge, which was precisely why its misuse had been so catastrophically consequential. When later generations of Atlanteans began directing the crystal's energies toward destructive purposes as a weapon, as a tool of domination, as an instrument of the selfish ambitions that Casey identified as the characteristic spiritual failure of Atlantis' declining period, they created geological instabilities that accumulated across generations until the continent itself could no longer maintain structural coherence. The social drama that Casey described playing out across Atlantean history was framed in terms that his deeply Christian audience would have recognized immediately, even though the cosmological framework surrounding it was explicitly non-Christian. The fundamental conflict in Atlantean society was between two groups he called the Sons of the Law of One and the Sons of Belial, the former representing those who used Atlantean knowledge and capability in service of spiritual development and the elevation of all consciousness, the latter representing those who pursued material accumulation, personal power, and the exploitation of less developed beings for selfish benefit. This was essentially the story of good and evil, rendered in an Atlantean setting, with the additional theological complexity that both groups were understood to be operating within a karmic framework in which the consequences of choices made in Atlantean lifetimes would ripple forward across subsequent incarnations, shaping the spiritual challenges and capabilities of souls reborn in later historical periods. The specific location predictions embedded in Casey's readings gave his Atlantis mythology a concreteness and a testability that Blavatsky's cosmic schemes had deliberately avoided. He specified that records of Atlantean civilization had been preserved in 3 locations in a hall of records beneath the right paw of the Great Sphinx of Giza in Egypt, in a temple complex somewhere in the Yucatan Peninsula, and in the waters near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas. These predictions created ongoing expectations among his followers that physical evidence would eventually validate his psychic revelations, expectations that gained dramatic apparent confirmation in 1968 when a formation of rectangular limestone blocks arranged in linear patterns on the ocean floor near Bimini was discovered and immediately publicized as the Bimini Road, the ancient Atlantean pathway that Casey had predicted would be found. Geological analysis would subsequently demonstrate that the Bimini Formation was a natural limestone feature created by entirely ordinary geological processes. But by the time that conclusion had been established through careful scientific investigation, the initial excitement had already entered the permanent mythology surrounding Casey's readings, becoming one of those stories that circulates indefinitely in alternative history communities, regardless of its subsequent debunking. The influence of Casey's Atlantis readings on 20th century New Age movements proved both profound and remarkably durable, outlasting by decades the specific cultural moment that had produced them. The emphasis on crystal technology resonated with New Age interests in alternative healing and subtle energy work, providing a prestigious ancient precedent for practices that mainstream medicine dismissed as pseudo-scientific. The reincarnation themes gave individuals a framework for understanding spiritual experiences and personal capabilities that seemed to transcend ordinary human limitations. The sense of inexplicable familiarity with ancient cultures, the feeling of carrying knowledge that formal education had never provided, the intuition of having lived before in circumstances more dramatic and more spiritually significant than the present could offer. Perhaps most consequentially, Casey's specific location predictions kept the search for physical evidence alive across generations of followers who funded expeditions, supported researchers, and maintained communities of inquiry organized around the conviction that proof was always just one more excavation away, that the Hall of Records beneath the Sphinx was real and recoverable, and that finding it would vindicate not just Casey's readings, but an entire alternative vision of human history that mainstream scholarship had failed to take seriously. The 20th century arrived with a scientific establishment that was, for the first time in history, genuinely equipped to test the claims that 2 millennia of Atlantis speculation had accumulated. Previous eras had lacked the tools, the dating techniques, the underwater exploration technology, the geological analysis methods, the systematic archaeological methodology necessary to move the Atlantis question from the realm of philosophical argument and textual interpretation into the domain of empirical investigation. That changed with remarkable speed across the first half of the century, as professional archaeology established rigorous standards for excavation, documentation, and peer review that created a systematic mechanism for distinguishing reliable historical knowledge from wishful thinking. The development of stratigraphic excavation techniques, the eventual arrival of radiocarbon dating in 1949, and the steady accumulation of comparative archaeological knowledge about ancient civilizations across the globe combined to create a body of evidence against which specific Atlantis claims could be measured with unprecedented precision. What that measurement consistently revealed was absence, the absence of any archaeological trace of an advanced Atlantic civilization during the periods proposed by various theorists. The absence of geological evidence for recently submerged continental landmasses in the Atlantic, and the absence of any artifact or architectural remain that could not be more parsimoniously explained by known historical processes than by invoking a lost mother civilization whose influence had supposedly shaped every culture on Earth. The scientific verdict on Atlantis, reached not through a single dramatic refutation, but through the steady accumulation of negative evidence across decades of professional investigation, was essentially the same as Aristotle's had been 23 centuries earlier, only now it rested on a foundation of empirical knowledge rather than philosophical skepticism alone. The archaeological investigation of Mediterranean Bronze Age civilizations during the first decades of the century produced the most intellectually interesting chapter in this story, interesting precisely because the initial evidence seemed, for a tantalizing moment, to support the Atlantis hypothesis before more careful analysis revealed why it did not. Sir Arthur Evans began excavating the Minoan Palace complex at Knossos on the island of Crete in 1900. Revealing a sophisticated civilization that had flourished during the second millennium before the Christian era and possessed characteristics that seemed to echo specific elements of Plato's account with almost uncomfortable precision. The Minoan palaces featured elaborate hydraulic systems, indoor plumbing, sophisticated drainage networks, decorative water features that matched Plato's emphasis on Atlantean mastery of water management. The evidence for long-distance maritime trade connecting Minoan Crete with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Western Mediterranean suggested the kind of international commercial reach that Plato had attributed to Atlantis. The artistic representations found throughout the palace complexes included bull-leaping ceremonies rendered in vivid frescoes, and Plato had described ritual bull hunts as a central feature of Atlantean religious practice. Conducted in the sacred precinct of the Temple of Poseidon, as the ceremony through which the 10 kings renewed their collective commitment to divine law. Evans himself initially drew these parallels explicitly, and the scholarly community found them sufficiently compelling to generate serious discussion about a potential Minoan historical basis for Plato's narrative. The sudden collapse of Minoan civilization around 1450 years before the Christian era, apparently triggered by a combination of natural disaster and foreign invasion, provided the kind of catastrophic ending that Plato's account required. However, as archaeological investigation of Minoan civilization deepened and the analytical tools available to researchers grew more sophisticated, the apparent parallels to Atlantis began dissolving under closer scrutiny in ways that revealed a fundamental problem with the entire enterprise of identifying Atlantis with any known Bronze Age civilization. The chronological framework established through pottery analysis and early radiocarbon dating placed Minoan civilization firmly in the second millennium before the Christian era, approximately 8,000 years more recent than the 9,500 BC date that Plato had specified for Atlantis. Geographical analysis revealed that Minoan influence, while impressive for its regional context, remained confined to the eastern Mediterranean rather than encompassing the global empire that Plato's account required. Most fundamentally, detailed examination of Minoan political structure revealed a decentralized system of multiple palace centers operating as independent or semi-independent entities, a political reality that differed completely from the unified imperial monarchy of 10 divine lineage kings that Plato had described. The peaceful character of early Minoan sites, evidenced by the absence of fortification walls around major settlements, contradicted Plato's emphasis on Atlantean military organization and imperial aggression. The Mycenaean civilization of mainland Greece presented a similarly frustrating pattern: initial apparent promise followed by fundamental incompatibility. The Mycenaean Linear B tablets revealed a complex palace bureaucracy capable of organizing large-scale military and economic activities, and archaeological evidence suggested Mycenaean influence extending throughout the Mediterranean during the late 2nd millennium before the Christian era. Yet systematic analysis revealed the same chronological limitations, the same geographical inadequacy, and the same absence of the specific institutional features that Plato had described. The discovery of the Uluburun shipwreck off the Turkish coast in 1982 added a further dimension to this picture. The ship's cargo: raw copper from Cyprus, gold from Nubia, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, tin from sources still debated, demonstrated that Bronze Age maritime trade networks connected distant regions with a sophistication that exceeded what many scholars had previously imagined. But this evidence of genuine Bronze Age complexity actually deepened the problem for Atlantis theorists rather than resolving it. Every artifact in the Uluburun cargo could be traced to known sources within the established network of Bronze Age Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations. There was no artifact whose origin pointed to an unknown Atlantic source. No material that required the existence of a sophisticated civilization in the Atlantic Ocean to explain its presence on a ship sailing between known Bronze Age trading partners. The development of deep ocean geological survey techniques during the second half of the century delivered what amounted to the definitive geological verdict on Atlantic continent theories. Systematic bathymetric mapping of the Atlantic Ocean floor revealed an abyssal plain lying at depths of 3,000 to 4,000 meters below sea level across the vast majority of the ocean's extent, depths incompatible with any recent submersion of a continental landmass that could have supported civilization. Analysis of deep ocean sediment cores, extracted from locations across the Atlantic floor and representing geological records extending back millions of years, showed consistent patterns of deep water deposition with no indication of the terrestrial sediments, pollen deposits, or freshwater biological indicators that would have been present had a large inhabited landmass been submerged within the last 15,000 years. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge System, the underwater mountain chain running the length of the Atlantic Ocean, was revealed through plate tectonic analysis to be a zone of seafloor spreading, where new oceanic crust was being continuously created, gradually expanding the ocean rather than preserving remnants of a submerged continent. The volcanic islands associated with this ridge, including the Azores, were demonstrated through radiometric dating to be recent geological formations created by volcanic activity, not the mountain peaks of a sunken civilization, but the newest additions to an ocean floor that had never, within any time frame relevant to human history, supported the kind of continental landmass that Atlantis required. One of the more productive consequences of the scientific investigation of Atlantis claims was the discovery made almost as a byproduct of the search for something that did not exist, that the ancient world had experienced genuine catastrophes of a scale and suddenness capable of inspiring exactly the kinds of stories that Plato's narrative preserved. These were not Atlantis. They were something in certain respects more interesting real events that left real archaeological signatures, real geological records, and real traces in the cultural memories of the peoples who survived them. The challenge for researchers was distinguishing between the legitimate historical significance of these events and the temptation to treat them as confirmations of Plato's specific account a temptation that proved, across decades of Atlantis scholarship, almost impossibly difficult to resist. The first and most compelling of these genuine catastrophes to be connected with Atlantis research was the Bronze Age volcanic eruption at Thera, the island known today as Santorini, in the southern Aegean Sea, Spyridon Marinatus. A Greek archaeologist who served as the Inspector General of the Greek Archaeological Service during the 1930s, had noticed something peculiar about the Minoan sites on Crete that Evans and his successors had been excavating. Scattered throughout the archaeological layers corresponding to the period of Minoan collapse were thick deposits of pumice, the lightweight volcanic rock produced by explosive eruptions when superheated magma saturated with dissolved gases expands violently as it reaches the surface. Pumice deposits of this density and distribution did not result from ordinary geological processes in the Cretan landscape. They required a volcanic source of extraordinary power located somewhere in the Aegean, and their distribution pattern pointed toward a single catastrophic event rather than a gradual accumulation across multiple minor eruptions. Marinatos published his hypothesis in 1939, proposing that a massive volcanic eruption on Thera had generated tsunamis and ashfalls of sufficient force and scale to devastate Minoan coastal settlements throughout the Aegean, triggering the civilizational collapse that the archaeological record documented. He would not be able to test this hypothesis directly for nearly 3 decades. The interruption of the Second World War and the subsequent demands of post-war reconstruction in Greece delayed systematic excavation of the Theran site. When he finally began digging at the site known as Akrotiri, on the southern coast of Santorini in 1967, what emerged from beneath the volcanic ash was one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Akrotiri was a Bronze Age city frozen in time, preserved by the same volcanic deposits that had buried and destroyed it with a completeness that Pompeii's preservation by Vesuvian ash, the standard benchmark for volcanic archaeological sites, could barely match. Multi-story buildings stood to their original heights, their walls still bearing vivid frescoes depicting maritime processions, exotic animals, flowering landscapes, and young people engaged in athletic and ceremonial activities. Storage vessels still sat in their original positions. Furniture left their impressions in the hardened ash. The inhabitants had clearly received some warning of the impending catastrophe, unlike Pompeii. No human remains were found at Akrotiri, suggesting an organized evacuation before the final explosive phase of the eruption. But they had left behind a material record of Bronze Age urban life, of extraordinary completeness and intimacy. The frescoes were particularly revelatory. One extraordinary composition, known as the miniature frieze, depicted an entire maritime landscape, ships sailing between fortified coastal towns, dolphins leaping in the harbour waters, warriors and civilians lining the shore that provided a window into the visual world of Bronze Age Aegean civilization with a clarity that no other site could match. The scale of the Theran eruption, when geological investigation began to establish its parameters, proved genuinely staggering. Estimates of its force suggested an explosion roughly 4 times larger than the Krakatoa eruption of 1883, itself one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded history. Heard 3,000 miles away and generating tsunamis that killed over 30,000 people across the Indonesian archipelago, the Theran eruption would have produced tsunamis capable of devastating coastal settlements throughout the eastern Mediterranean, ash clouds that blocked sunlight across the region for months, and atmospheric effects that could have disrupted agricultural cycles across an area encompassing Greece, Egypt, and the Levant. The collapse of the volcanic cone into the emptied magma chamber beneath it created the spectacular circular caldera that defines Santorini's geography today, a geographical feature that subsequent researchers would identify as a potential physical model for Plato's concentric rings of land and water, the distinctive topography of the Atlantean capital preserved in the geological memory of the Aegean's most dramatic landscape. Marinatos argued that this catastrophic destruction of Minoan civilization provided the historical foundation for Plato's Atlantis narrative, the actual event that Egyptian priests had preserved in their temple records and transmitted to Solon during his visit to Sais. The geographical details in Plato's account, according to this interpretation, had been distorted through centuries of oral transmission, with the original Aegean location transformed into an Atlantic setting, and the actual chronology inflated from a few centuries to 9,000 years through misunderstanding of Egyptian calendrical systems. It was an elegant hypothesis, and its elegance was precisely its problem. The chronological discrepancy between the Theron eruption occurring somewhere between 1700 and 1500 years before the Christian era, depending on which dating method is applied, and Plato's specification of 9,500 years before his own era, represented a gap of roughly 8,000 years that no theory of calendrical confusion could comfortably bridge. Even the most generous interpretation of Egyptian chronological error could not multiply a Bronze Age date by a factor sufficient to produce Plato's ancient timeline without straining credulity beyond any reasonable breaking point. The Black Sea catastrophic flood hypothesis, developed by the American oceanographers William Ryan and Walter Pittman during the 1990s, brought a different kind of genuine geological catastrophe into the Atlantis conversation, one that matched Plato's timeline more closely than the Theron eruption, while offering a mechanism for civilizational destruction of genuine, dramatic force. Ryan and Pittman's research revealed compelling evidence that the Black Sea had experienced a catastrophic flooding event approximately 7,500 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the natural rock dam at the Bosphorus Strait and poured into what had been a much smaller freshwater lake, sitting at a level roughly 150 meters below the Mediterranean. The flood that resulted would have been of almost unimaginable violence, a wall of salt water advancing across the lake's shoreline at a rate that would have drowned hundreds of square kilometers of previously dry and inhabited land, within weeks or months, permanently submerging an area of approximately 100,000 square kilometers and displacing human populations whose farming settlements dotted the former lakeshore. Robert Ballard's subsequent exploration of the Black Sea floor using remotely operated vehicles capable of operating in the basin's oxygen-free deep waters, which preserve organic materials that would decay rapidly in normal marine environments, discovered what appeared to be preserved wooden structures and other artifacts at depths consistent with the pre-flood shoreline, their dating placing them comfortably within the period of human settlement before the catastrophic inundation. The Black Sea flood was real. It was catastrophic. And it occurred within a time frame that could plausibly have fed into the oral traditions that eventually reached Plato through his chain of transmission. But the settlements it destroyed, as subsequent investigation revealed, were simple farming communities, not the sophisticated urban civilization with advanced technology, imperial organization, and monumental architecture that Plato had described. The catastrophe was genuine. The civilization it supposedly destroyed remained, as always, conspicuously absent from the archaeological record. If the history of Atlantis scholarship were a map, the 20th and 21st centuries would show it completely covered every ocean, every continent, every significant body of water on the planet, proposed by at least one serious researcher as the true location of Plato's lost civilization: the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Black Sea, the North Sea, the Caribbean, the Antarctic. Each has had its advocates, its monographs, its documentary television programs, its online communities of dedicated supporters. This proliferation of proposed locations is itself one of the most significant facts about modern Atlantis research, because it reveals something that individual theorists are rarely willing to acknowledge about their own work when a hypothesis can be located everywhere. It is effectively located nowhere. The geographic promiscuity of modern Atlantis theories reflects not the richness of available evidence, but the flexibility of a narrative framework capacious enough to accommodate almost any ancient civilization that experienced catastrophic decline, almost any geological event that submerged previously inhabited land, and almost any culture that built impressive stone structures or developed sophisticated water management systems. Each new proposed location arrives, accompanied by the same argumentative structure, a set of apparent correspondences between Plato's description and the candidate site's characteristics. A reinterpretation of some geographical detail that relocates the story from the Atlantic to the preferred location, and an explanation for why the chronological discrepancy between Plato's ancient dates and the candidate civilization's actual timeframe should not be treated as a disqualifying problem. The pattern is so consistent across dozens of different theories advanced by researchers working independently across decades that it amounts to a genre with recognizable conventions, a form of historical argument that generates new instances continuously without ever converging on a solution. The Sardinian hypothesis, developed by Italian researcher Sergio Frau and published in his 2002 work Le Colonne d'École, represented one of the more methodologically interesting of these modern proposals because its central argument was geographical rather than archaeological, a reinterpretation of where Plato's Pillars of Hercules actually stood, if accepted, would relocate the entire Atlantis narrative from the Atlantic to the central Mediterranean. Frau argued extensively, drawing on ancient geographical sources including Homer, Hesiod, and various early Greek geographers, that the designation Pillars of Hercules had originally referred to the Strait of Sicily, the narrow passage between Sicily and North Africa that separates the western from the eastern Mediterranean rather than to the Strait of Gibraltar, and that the geographical shift in the terms referent had occurred gradually as Greek navigational knowledge expanded westward during the Archaic and Classical periods. If Frau's reinterpretation were correct, then Plato's claim that Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules would place it in the western Mediterranean rather than the Atlantic Ocean, a geographical relocation that would make the island of Sardinia and its surrounding seas a plausible candidate for Plato's lost civilization. The Nuragic culture that had inhabited Sardinia during the Bronze Age provided the archaeological substance for Frau's identification. This genuinely impressive civilization had constructed thousands of distinctive stone towers, the nuraghi, that give the culture its name across the Sardinian landscape between approximately 1800 and 700 years before the Christian era, demonstrating advanced engineering capabilities and a level of social organization capable of coordinating large-scale construction projects across an island whose challenging terrain would have made communication and resource management genuinely demanding. The sudden decline of Nuragic civilization around 1200 years before the Christian era, coinciding with the broader Bronze Age collapse that devastated civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean, simultaneously provided a historically documented catastrophic ending that could potentially correspond to the destruction Plato described. Charles Hapgood's Antarctica hypothesis occupied a different intellectual register, entirely less an archaeological proposal than a geological theory with Atlantis implications, built on a foundation of ideas about Earth's physical structure that mainstream geological science rejected comprehensively, but that continued to generate popular fascination decades after their initial proposal. Hapgood, an American academic who taught at Keene State College in New Hampshire, published his theory of Earth crustal displacement in 1958, arguing that the planet's outer crust could shift rapidly relative to the inner core, causing dramatic changes in the geographical positions of continents and the climate zones associated with different latitudes. According to this theory, Antarctica had been located in a temperate climate zone as recently as 12,000 years ago, precisely the period Plato associated with Atlantis, potentially supporting an advanced civilization before crustal displacement moved the continent to its current polar position and buried it under the ice sheet that now covers it. The apparent support for Hapgood's theory came primarily from his analysis of medieval cartography, particularly the Piri-Reis map of 1513, an Ottoman chart that appeared to depict coastlines corresponding to Antarctic geography, with a precision that seemed impossible for a civilization that would not officially discover Antarctica until 1820. The presence of apparently accurate Antarctic coastal details in a map produced 3 centuries before the continent's known discovery suggested to Hapgood that ancient civilizations had possessed geographical knowledge of Antarctica. Before the ice sheets obscured its coastlines, knowledge that could only have been accumulated when those coastlines were accessible and inhabited. Mainstream cartographers and historians of science examined Hapgood's map analysis carefully and concluded that the apparent correspondences between the Piri Reis coastlines and Antarctic geography resulted from selective comparison and wishful interpretation, rather than genuine cartographic accuracy, that the southern landmass depicted on the map corresponded to speculative representations of a hypothetical southern continent that European geographers had been including on maps for theoretical reasons since antiquity, not to accurate surveys of actual Antarctic coastlines. The geological evidence was equally decisive. Antarctic ice core analysis and marine sediment records established that the continent's ice sheet had been continuously present for at least 15 million years, with fluctuations in extent that never exposed substantial ice-free land areas during any period when human civilizations could plausibly have existed. The Doñana National Park hypothesis, developed by German researcher Rainer Kuhn in the early 2000s and publicized through satellite imagery analysis, represented the kind of modern Atlantis proposal that demonstrated both the genuine power of new remote sensing technologies and the persistent tendency of Atlantis researchers to interpret ambiguous evidence through the lens of predetermined conclusions. Satellite imagery of the Doñana wetlands in southwestern Spain, a protected national park at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, close to the traditional location of the Pillars of Hercules, revealed circular and rectangular patterns beneath the marshland surface that Kuhn and his collaborators interpreted as the buried remains of Atlantean architecture. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site detected subsurface anomalies consistent with buried structures, generating genuine archaeological interest that led to a limited investigation program. The geographical location was genuinely suggestive, closer to Plato's specified position beyond the Pillars of Hercules than most Mediterranean candidates, and in a region where Bronze Age civilizations had indeed flourished and left significant archaeological traces. But the evidence for specifically Atlantean remains at Doñana remained frustratingly ambiguous, consistent with buried structures of some kind but insufficient to establish their age, cultural affiliation, or relationship to anything Plato had described. The site's protected status as a national park severely limited the invasive investigation that would have been necessary to resolve these ambiguities definitively, leaving the hypothesis in the permanent suspended animation of the intriguing but unverified, which is, as any survey of Atlantis research reveals, precisely where most modern location theories ultimately reside, generating excitement without resolution and keeping the search perpetually alive without ever bringing it to a conclusion. There is a particular moment in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, published in 1870, when Captain Nemo leads Professor Aronnax out of the Nautilus through the submarine's airlock and across the ocean floor by lantern light, moving through absolute darkness until Nemo raises his lamp to illuminate what lies ahead, and what lies ahead is Atlantis. Ruined columns, collapsed temple porticos, statues broken at the waist, their upper halves lying in the silt that has accumulated across millennia of oceanic silence. Streets that once carried the traffic of an imperial civilization now carpeted in marine growth, their original pavements visible only where the current has swept them clean. Verne describes the scene with the controlled restraint of a writer who understands that some images require understatement to achieve their full effect. Nemo stands in silence, one hand pressed to his heart, tears visible in his eyes through the glass of his helmet, and says nothing, because nothing adequate could be said. This scene, occupying only a few pages of a novel primarily concerned with submarine adventure and natural history, accomplished something that 2,000 years of philosophical commentary, scholarly debate, and speculative theorizing had never managed. It made Atlantis feel real in the way that only fiction can make things feel real, not as a historical claim requiring evidence, but as an imaginative experience, requiring only the willingness to see what the story puts before you. Verne established in those few pages the visual and emotional template for virtually every subsequent popular treatment of Atlantis. the submerged ruins glimpsed through water, the sense of a civilization interrupted rather than concluded. The combination of grandeur and melancholy that attends the contemplation of something magnificent that time has unmade. Every underwater Atlantis scene in every film and television program and video game produced across the following century and a half owes something to the image Verne constructed in 1870. In a scene he wrote, not as the novel's climax, but almost as an aside. The pulp magazine era of the early 20th century transformed Verne's elegiac image into raw material for adventure fiction of dramatically less restraint and considerably more excitement. Publications like Amazing Stories, Weird Tales, and Adventure, which dominated popular fiction between the 1910s and the 1940s, created both the market and the conventions for a distinctively American genre of Atlantis story faster, louder, more concerned with action and spectacle than with the melancholy grandeur that Verne had favoured. Robert A. Howard, whose Conan stories began appearing in Weird Tales from 1932 onward, integrated Atlantis into a comprehensive fictional prehistory of such imaginative density and internal consistency that it effectively created an alternative ancient world capable of supporting indefinite narrative expansion. Howard's Hyborian Age chronology positioned Atlantis and its sister continent Lemuria as the twin peaks of humanity's first great civilizational cycle, whose destruction had scattered survivors across the globe to establish the various kingdoms and cultures within which Conan's adventures unfolded. The Atlanteans in Howard's stories were not the spiritually advanced beings of theosophical tradition or the philosophically significant exemplars of Plato's allegory. They were a warrior, people whose physical vitality and fierce independence Howard contrasted with the decadence and spiritual exhaustion of the more sophisticated civilizations that had inherited their world. This interpretation resonated powerfully with Depression-era readers anxious about what rapid urbanization and industrial modernity were doing to traditional masculine virtues, and it established a version of Atlantean identity vigorous, primal, uncorrupted by excessive sophistication that would recur across popular culture treatments of the lost civilization for decades. The comic book medium's contribution to Atlantis mythology proved particularly significant in establishing visual conventions that would later migrate into film and television with a directness that testified to comics' extraordinary influence on 20th century visual imagination. DC Comics introduced Aquaman in 1941, presenting Atlantis as a thriving underwater kingdom whose inhabitants had adapted biologically to marine life while retaining advanced technology and a political organization recognizable as monarchical, a king, a throne, a palace, rival factions competing for power, and a hero whose dual identity as both Atlantean royalty and surface world ally allowed for stories that explored the tensions between two civilizations with fundamentally incompatible relationships to the ocean environment. Marvel Comics' treatment of Atlantis through the character of Namor the Submariner, who had actually preceded Aquaman by 2 years in his 1939 debut, offered a considerably more morally complex and politically interesting vision of the lost civilization and its relationship to the surface world. Namor's Atlantis was not simply an exotic adventure setting, but a genuine civilization with its own interests, grievances, and historical claims, a people who had existed in the ocean for millennia while surface civilizations rose and fell above them, and who had entirely legitimate reasons to regard the pollution, noise, and physical intrusion of industrial surface civilization as acts of aggression requiring military response. The ambiguity of Namor's heroism simultaneously defending Atlantean sovereignty against genuine surface world depredations and threatening innocent people with the oceanic destruction his military capabilities made possible gave the Marvel Atlantis a moral and political texture that DC's more straightforwardly heroic treatment never achieved. These comic book versions of Atlantis reached audiences measured in the tens of millions across the mid-20th century, establishing visual expectations about what Atlantean architecture looked like, how Atlanteans moved through water, what technologies they employed, And what political structures organized their society expectations that became so thoroughly embedded in popular consciousness that subsequent film and television treatments needed to engage with them, whether they wished to or not? Disney's animated feature, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, released in 2001, represented the most ambitious attempt to synthesize a century of popular culture Atlantis imagery into a single comprehensive vision. Drawing on everything from Verne's sunken ruins to Casey's crystal power source to theosophical concepts of spiritual energy, while packaging the result in the visual language of early 20th century adventure comics filtered through cutting-edge digital animation technology, the films constructed Atlantean language. Developed by professional linguist Mark Okrand, the same scholar who had created the Klingon language for the Star Trek franchise, demonstrated the level of authentic cultural detail that early 21st century audiences had come to expect from fictional world building, and its biomechanical aesthetic, presenting Atlantean technology as integrated with organic forms rather than imposed upon them, created a visual signature genuinely distinctive within the crowded field of Atlantis popular culture. Video games extended this trajectory further, creating interactive Atlantis environments in which players could explore submerged cities, investigate ancient ruins, and engage with Atlantean cultures as participants rather than observers, an immersive engagement with the lost civilization mythology that no passive medium could replicate. And that suggested the story's popular cultural future would be shaped increasingly by technologies of experience rather than technologies of narrative alone. At some point in any serious engagement with the Atlantis phenomenon, the historical and archaeological questions begin to feel secondary to a deeper and more genuinely puzzling one. The absence of archaeological evidence for an advanced Atlantic civilization is, by now, about as thoroughly established as the absence of evidence for anything can be deep ocean surveys, sediment core analysis, systematic archaeological investigation of every proposed site, and the comprehensive failure of 2 centuries of alternative history research to produce a single artifact, a single structural remain, or a single datable geological signature consistent with the existence of the civilization Plato described. And yet the belief persists, not just persists, flourishes, generating new theories, new documentary programs, new online communities, new books claiming fresh revelations, new expeditions funded by people who genuinely believe they are on the verge of the most significant archaeological discovery in human history. The question this raises is not archaeological or geological or even philosophical in the traditional sense. It is psychological. What is it about this particular story, this one narrative, from this one philosopher, preserved in 2 incomplete dialogues from the 4th century before the Christian era, that makes it essentially immune to debunking? What human need does it serve that no amount of contradictory evidence can permanently dislodge? The answer, when examined carefully, turns out to be not one need but several, layered upon each other in ways that make the Atlantis mythology remarkably resistant to the kind of frontal assault that scientific refutation represents, because the needs it serves are not primarily intellectual ones, and intellectual counterarguments, however devastating, do not reach the places where those needs actually live. The most fundamental of these needs is the one that Carl Jung identified as characteristic of mythological thinking across cultures and historical periods: the need for narrative frameworks that give individual and collective experience shape comprehensible to the human mind at a level deeper than rational analysis can reach. The story of Atlantis, stripped to its structural essence, is one of the oldest and most psychologically resonant narratives in the human repertoire, a golden age of extraordinary achievement, a gradual corruption of the values that made that achievement possible, and a catastrophic destruction that serves simultaneously as punishment, as warning, and as proof that the universe maintains some relationship between moral reality and material consequence. This narrative structure appears in forms recognizable across virtually every human culture: the Garden of Eden, the Hindu concept of declining yugas, the Greek myth of successive metallic ages from gold to iron, the Norse Ragnarok. It speaks to something in human consciousness that experiences the present as fallen relative to some better past, that intuits a connection between how people behave and what happens to them collectively, and that finds in catastrophic endings a perverse comfort, the comfort of knowing that the universe is not morally indifferent, that civilizations do not simply decline for random administrative reasons, but are unmade by their own choices. Plato understood this psychological structure with the precision of a master storyteller, and he deployed it in the Atlantis narrative with a craft that 2.5 millennia have not diminished. The story feels true in the way that the deepest myths feel true, not because it corresponds to archaeological reality, but because it corresponds to psychological reality, to the inner landscape of human experience, in a way that purely factual accounts rarely achieve. The appeal of lost wisdom represents a second and equally powerful driver of Atlantis belief, one that has become, if anything, more potent in the contemporary world than at any previous moment in the myth's history. Modern civilization produces more information than any previous society has generated, fragments it into increasingly narrow specializations that communicate poorly across disciplinary boundaries, and distributes it through media systems optimized for attention capture rather than genuine understanding. The result is a pervasive experience of knowing more and more about less and less, of possessing enormous quantities of technical information without any integrating framework that makes the whole comprehensible, meaningful, or connected to the questions of how to live that human beings have always needed answered. The idea that an ancient civilization possessed complete integrated knowledge, that the Atlanteans understood simultaneously the spiritual principles underlying material existence, the technological applications of natural forces, and the social forms that allowed human communities to flourish without destroying themselves, speaks directly to this contemporary fragmentation with the force of a wish that knows exactly what it is missing. This is why Atlantis theories consistently emphasize the civilization's mastery of both material and spiritual domains, presenting a model of human achievement that transcends the perceived limitations of modern specialized knowledge and offers hope that such integration remains possible, not through the slow, uncertain, perpetually incomplete process of scientific research, but through the recovery of something that already existed and was simply lost. The role of digital culture in the contemporary Atlantis phenomenon deserves particular attention because it has qualitatively changed the social dynamics through which alternative historical beliefs sustain and reinforce themselves. Previous generations of Atlantis believers were relatively isolated, separated by geography from others who shared their convictions, dependent on physical books and occasional public lectures for access to supporting material, and therefore in regular contact with mainstream culture's skepticism, whether they sought it or not. The internet eliminated all three of those constraints simultaneously. Online communities dedicated to Atlantis research can share information across global distances instantaneously, generate and circulate supporting material with no editorial gatekeeping of any kind, and create social environments in which the alternative historical worldview is so thoroughly normalized that mainstream archaeological skepticism appears and is explicitly framed as the eccentric outlier position rather than the well-evidenced consensus. The psychological comfort of belonging to a community of people who share your convictions should not be underestimated as a factor in the persistence of Atlantis belief. These communities offer their members not just a theory about ancient history, but an identity, the identity of someone who sees through official narratives, who asks the questions that credentialed authorities are too compromised or too timid to ask, who maintains intellectual independence in the face of institutional pressure to conform. The emotional satisfactions of this identity are real and substantial, and they operate largely independently of the evidential status of the specific beliefs that define the community. When archaeological investigation fails to find Atlantis, the community does not dissolve. It reinterprets the failure as confirmation that the search was looking in the wrong place, or that official archaeology is suppressing the evidence, or that the discovery has already been made but kept secret by interests threatened by what it would reveal. We have travelled a considerable distance together from the marble colonnades of Plato's Academy in 4th century Athens, through the manuscript libraries of Byzantium and the print shops of Renaissance Florence, across the Atlantic with Spanish conquistadors who saw Tenochtitlan and thought of orichalcum walls, through the Victorian parlours where Donnelly's grand unified prehistory dazzled readers hungry for exactly that kind of certainty, down through the theosophical cosmologies and the psychic readings, and the underwater archaeological surveys and the sediment core analyses and the documentary television programs and the online communities where the search continues with undiminished conviction, regardless of what science keeps, finding and not finding. It is a long journey. And it ends not with a discovery, but with a question, or rather, with the same question that the journey began with, now carrying rather more weight than it did when Plato first posed it in the opening pages of the Timaeus. Did Atlantis exist? The honest answer, after everything, is that we have no credible archaeological or geological evidence that it did, that every proposed location has failed under scrutiny, that the Atlantic Ocean floor contains no trace of the civilization Plato described, that the ancient world's most careful historians made no reference to any tradition independent of Plato's account, and that the internal characteristics of the narrative, its philosophical purposes, its precise allegorical structure, its perfect fit with Plato's broader intellectual project, point consistently toward a story deliberately constructed rather than faithfully transmitted. The case for Atlantis as literal history has not strengthened with the accumulation of research. It has, if anything, weakened each new investigative tool, revealing with greater precision the absence of evidence that previous tools had been insufficiently powerful to detect. And yet something about that conclusion feels, if not exactly wrong, then at least incomplete, as though answering the question of whether Atlantis existed as a literal place misses what the story has actually been doing across 25 centuries of continuous engagement with human imagination. Because the more interesting question, the question that the weight of this history actually demands, is not whether Atlantis was a real island that sank beneath the Atlantic Ocean 9,500 years before the birth of Christ. It is why this particular story, from this particular source, has proven more durable than virtually any other narrative in the Western tradition. Empires have risen and fallen since Plato wrote. Languages have been born and died. Religious systems that commanded the devotion of entire civilizations have been replaced by other religious systems, which have themselves been challenged and transformed. The specific philosophical concerns that animated Plato's Academy, the proper constitution of the ideal state, the relationship between virtue and happiness, the nature of knowledge and its relationship to opinion have been revisited, revised, and in many respects superseded by subsequent philosophical development. And through all of it, Atlantis has persisted, not just as a scholarly curiosity or an archaeological hypothesis, but as a living story, one that successive generations have found sufficiently compelling and sufficiently relevant to their own circumstances to retell, to reinterpret, to relocate, to reimagine, and to invest with emotional and intellectual energies that purely fictional constructs rarely command. The persistence itself is the phenomenon that demands explanation, and the explanation it demands is not geological but human. What Plato built in the Atlantis narrative, whatever his specific intentions, was a story perfectly calibrated to the shape of human anxiety about civilization, anxiety that has not diminished across 25 centuries, but has, if anything, intensified as the civilizations that humanity has built have grown larger, more powerful, more globally interconnected, and therefore more catastrophically vulnerable than anything Plato could have imagined. The specific content of that anxiety has shifted across different historical moments in the Renaissance. It was the anxiety of a culture rediscovering how much had been lost. In the Victorian era, it was the anxiety of a civilization whose unprecedented power raised unprecedented questions about permanence. In the nuclear age, it was the anxiety of a species that had acquired the technical capacity to do to itself what the gods had done to Atlantis. In the contemporary moment, it is the anxiety of a civilization that can watch in real time the environmental consequences of its own prosperity, accumulating toward thresholds that ecological science cannot fully predict but cannot responsibly ignore. In each of these moments, Atlantis has been available as a framework, a story that gives the anxiety a shape, a precedent, a narrative form that carries it from the paralyzing abstractness of genuine existential dread towards something that can be contemplated, discussed, and perhaps learned from. This is the function that Plato originally designed the story to serve. And the remarkable thing is not that it has continued to serve that function for 25 centuries, but that it has done so with such consistency, across such different cultural contexts and intellectual frameworks, as though the story itself were more durable than the specific anxieties it was built to address, as though it had identified something permanent about the human condition rather than something specific to 4th century Athens. The image that returns at the end of all this is Plato's own The Great Island Empire gleaming with orichalcum walls, the harbour crowded with ships from every corner of the known world, the temple of Poseidon blazing with reflected light across the water, and somewhere in the divine assembly of Olympus, Zeus looking down at it all with an expression that combines grief and inevitability in proportions that Plato, for once, does not attempt to specify, because the lesson of Atlantis, the real lesson, the one that does not require the civilization to have been literally real in order to be genuinely true, is not about island geography or Bronze Age metallurgy or the depth of the Atlantic Ocean floor. It is about the relationship between power and wisdom, between prosperity and virtue, between the extraordinary human capacity for building magnificent things and the equally extraordinary human capacity for undermining those things from within through the slow, almost invisible accumulation of choices that prioritize immediate advantage over long-term integrity. Every civilization that has ever believed itself permanent has been wrong. Every empire that has mistaken its military dominance for its moral superiority has eventually provided evidence to the contrary. Every culture that has confused the accumulation of wealth with the cultivation of wisdom has eventually discovered, at whatever cost the discovery required, that Plato was right about what happens when the divine element in human nature becomes diluted enough to stop mattering. The ocean has not swallowed us yet, but the mirror Plato held up, that strange, gleaming, orichalcum bright mirror, has never stopped reflecting something uncomfortably recognizable in the face of whoever stands before it. That is why Atlantis endures, not because it was real, because it is true.